I'll offer a few reflections. We'll see how they come out about constraint and freeness, and then maybe that'll form something of a context for us to explore together in terms of whatever might be alive for you. I'll speak a bit about what we earlier called inevitable constraints and a wise relationship to them. And then a little about the importance of leaning into constraint. And then something about the way we misassign, we mistake that, or we misapprehend constraint where there's actually freeness, and freeness where there's actually constraint. And maybe in that way we'll touch upon some of the kind of the thornier stuff of like the illusion of choice and free will. And then we'll see. So in the Buddhist tradition, I mean, the Buddha gave several maps of what we've been calling inevitable constraints. One of those is the survival constraints, which in the Buddhist tradition are called the 4 basic requisites, right? Food, shelter, clothing, medicine. So just to maintain a functional human life, one needs food, shelter, clothing, medicine. Very kind of ordinary, but also very important. And even though the way Buddha was living and the way those who kind of were hanging out with and practicing with the Buddha were living seemed very, very frugal and ascetic, that emphasis on just the importance of maintaining the basic requisites. And I think it can be humbling to reflect. How dependent is one's sense of well-being on having these survival requisites in place? How would you be when one or other of those or more were threatened? So we need adequate food, clothing, shelter, medicine. And maybe that we tend to misapprehend what adequate is in those areas. That's one of the benefits, actually, of some time where one lives very simply. And that might be going on a camping trip, right? And then, the appreciation for the simple comes alive. I might be going on a retreat. Well, I've got to share a room with someone? What do you mean there's no food in the afternoon? And then it's like, oh, actually, there's something freeing about simplifying our understanding of what adequate is. And maybe that we live actually in a surfeit of some of the requisites, which our world, our society holds up as being a great thing and a good thing. And yet, actually, sometimes we have to see for ourselves, well, what's adequate? And what's the level at which I'm well supported? And what's the level at which too little, not well supported, right? Anxious, if you don't have enough food, if you don't have shelter, etc., etc. That's not supportive. But actually, if you end up with too much, you can spend a lot of wasted time wondering which coat to wear, etc. And something about, you might think of yourself, moments of the simple life, where the senses come alive, where eating some burnt baked beans at the end of the day on a campfire, on that cliche that nothing has ever tasted so good. The appreciation of the simple. I lived pretty much the whole of the 90s without any electricity or running water. And I must say I'm quite glad to have electricity and running water these days. But there was a very, very rich and beautiful time of life. And it really changed my relationship forever to what it's like to put on a light switch. And so now it's at least 20 years of living with electricity, but still, it's like rarely a switching on of a light goes by without me being in some way struck by the miracle of it and the not taking for grantedness of it. And of course, we can see the hardship and the distress and the just very real suffering of maybe times in our life when we've known that, or those that we might recognize around us, who really are struggling to maintain those basic requisites. It's very hard to be interested in the deeper things of life, in exploring the nature of constraint and freeness, when you're hungry, cold, wet, tired, sick. And actually, it's interesting that these kinds of all the great contemplative and metaphysical traditions, as well as the sort of philosophical and artistic traditions, grew out of situations where the basic requisites had been met. Agriculture had been developed, like in North India at the time of not just the time of the Buddha, but that whole kind of rich philosophical and artistic tradition. Right? Part of the reason for that is just the fertility of the Indo-Gangetic plain. And this is a whole vast tract where it was kind of quite easy with climate and soil conditions and weather, I mean, really basic things. So that the sort of the foundations of people being able to feed, clothe, medicate, and shelter themselves was kind of well enough met that then the interest can go deeper. So that's, on the one hand, is very, very ordinary stuff. But again, the appreciation of the ordinary, important. So that's one of the maps. Right? Without the basic requisites in place, it's hard to have a kind of stability or sense of sufficiency in order for the interest and the capacity to look deeper, to grow. And then that model we just spoke about this morning, aging, sickness, and death. Right? Just very real constraints. Very real constraints. And actually doesn't matter how good your food and shelter and medicine and thank you. I will just call them those four. It doesn't matter how good those four are, you're still going to get old and sick and die. And not necessarily even in that order. And just, it's humbling, or at least it can be humbling, or it can be humiliating, like aging. Right? If we hold on to some self-image that's all young and healthy, then it's quite humiliating. You know, there's enough of us here who've gone far enough down the road of graying and wrinkling and fagging and all of that. It's like, oh yeah, it can be humiliating, or it can be humbling. Oh yeah, it's like this. We're going around the road exactly right. If we're getting old and seizing up and things are going wrong and we can feel death looming at the end of it, it's just right. If that wasn't happening, really, if that wasn't happening, something would be very wrong. Right? And just so partly the inevitability of that, but partly just the rightness of that. So what kind of a constraint is it? It is a kind of constraint, right? We're not going to survive this human experience, but it's the right kind of constraint. It's an inevitable kind of constraint. It's the constraint on which every single atom and expression of life is formed, arising and expressing and passing. And yet the ways we can feel ourselves kind of rebel against that, suffer over that, keep catching ourselves with alarm in the mirror in the morning. That thing about raging against the dying of the light. Like, no, don't rage against the dying of the light. Get with the program. All your raging against the dying of the light is going to do is make you feel rageful. Right? So just get with the program. Let the light die. It's going to die anyway, but it's better to die gracefully than ragefully. But that's kind of unpopular. I love people say that, rage against the dying of the light with great, fire in their eyes. It's always struck me as a little strange. And then there's the constraints of what in the Buddhist tradition are called the worldly winds. Right? There's, again, inevitable constraints that we're all subject to. The pairs. Are you familiar with the worldly winds? Praise and blame. Pain and pleasure. Gain and loss. Success and failure. And the way those all belong to each other. They belong to each other. We only know pleasure because of its contrast with pain. We only relate to a sense of success because of its contrast with or counterpoint to a sense of failure. And yet, again, we track our own relationship to those things. And these three maps between them describe pretty much all of the vicissitudes, all of the constraints we might go through. Right? The basic material constraints around the requisites, those four. Just the life journey constraints of aging and sickness and death. And then all the stuff that plays out in our relationships and our careers and that which we value and that which we invest in and that which we hope for, right? Which belongs to the world of pleasure and pain, gain and loss, success and failure, praise and blame. And actually, the more we invest in anything, right, the more you generate momentum in anything, the more you stand out in anything, the more you excel at anything, the stronger the winds get. The more look at anybody in the public eye, right? There's nobody who's universally praised. Look at the poor politicians. Praised from one side, blamed from the other side. Look at Jesus is a good example. Poor old Jesus. Sure, there's nothing wrong. He's a great exemplar of a life of love and prayer and service. And he chopped off his ears, strung him up, crucified him. Praise and blame. That's actually one of the beautiful things about that line on the cross. Forgive them, Father, they know what they do. That's equanimity in the face of praise and blame. And just the relationship we have is just, and it's an invitation, right, to just reflect, what's the relationship I have to praise and blame? Because to the extent to which I depend on, reach for, prop my sense of okayness up with praise, to the extent I'm looking for you to approve of me, reassure me, assuage my insecurities, tell me what I want to hear, that's a very fragile condition. The extent to which I depend on that is the exact extent to which I suffer over you when you blame, disapprove, dislike me, etc. So you can see for yourself, there may be one or other of those pairs that you get more enmeshed in. Some of us are pleasure seekers to such an extent that we actually believe that if I could just figure things out right, if I should just organize the circumstances, I could make everything pleasurable. The kind of advertising is often selling that dream to us. Like everything's like yoga magazines or meditation magazines as well. Especially in meditation magazines, everyone sits like this. Most meditation isn't like that. It's more like just the opportunity. This is good. There's often an over-reliance, I think, on meditation and mindfulness of breathing and things like that as being what Dharma practice is. But here you are living in a city, right? The worldly winds blow strong in a city. The expectations of society, the comparison with friends and colleagues, the kind of the measurement of worth and value, the concentration of materiality. Okay, I live in the middle of the forest, and I often I notice that when I come to the city, just the greater concentration of wealth and the contrast with the concentration of poverty, and just all of that. It's like, oh yeah, the worldly winds stand out more, blow strong here. That's Dharma practice. That's an engagement with freedom and constraint, just tracking yourself amidst those worldly winds, seeing how they blow on you, getting skillful at letting them blow through. And then when they don't blow through, when they catch you and blow you around, what am I doing? What have I been seduced by? What am I hoping for? What am I believing? And of course, some meditation practice, some quiet sitting in the morning or the evening or whatever, actually helps to have enough presence and clarity and steadiness and brightness of mind to be able to do that tracking. But too often, people do their little sitting in the morning, and then I meet with them and they say, oh, I did my practice this morning. I'm like, well, that's nice, but what about right now? It's 24 hours in a day. What a shame that you only practice for half an hour at the beginning. So informal practice and then informal practice, and the symbiotic relationship between those two. So there's the world of constraints, and maybe it's not quite exhaustive, but I think it probably is pretty much. Consider the constraints of your life: situational constraints, emotional constraints, any old constraints, and you can probably find them somewhere in those three maps: requisites, life, heavenly messengers, as they're called, aging, sickness, and death, and the worldly winds. And then that tracking I was just mentioning, and that encouragement to lean into constraint, because that's where you learn. Again, it's one of the things, even a day like this, right? There's a certain leaning into constraint. Right? You sit on your own. No one's telling you how long to sit for. And I'm sure for some of you, you just have a certain kind of discipline. You sit for X amount of time and you just stay there. But maybe for others, there's a kind of lack of, nobody's providing the constraint. So when I feel a bit bored or a bit restless, or my phone pings, my phone doesn't ping, but I wonder what it's doing anyway, or whatever, then, and then you take yourself out of constraint and you miss an opportunity often, right? Whereas here, it's like, basically you just carry on sitting till I ring the bell, right? And maybe you don't like it and you think, why doesn't he ring it sooner? Or he didn't even say how long until he was going to ring it or something. But that's the opportunity, right? Just to lean into the constraint. You get that the constraint concentrates the moment, right? And constraint concentrates the opportunity. Going on retreat, it's a way of leaning into constraint, undertaking some sort of voluntary simplicity around the requisites, for example. So there's two ways of leaning into constraint. Right? One is intentional, so undertaking a practice. Right? I'm going to sit every day, or I'm going to sit for X amount of time, or I'm going to go on a retreat, or I'm going to undertake whatever it is. Voluntarily lean into some sense of constraint because it shows me how I am. It shows me my relationship. It shows me the way I meet the worldly winds, for example. And then the other form of leaning into constraint is not creating intentional constraints, but just recognizing the constraints that have become habituated in me. Right? The constraints of just the way my life has gone along and the ways I've felt in some way wounded by my life, afraid of various situations, resentful to certain people, etc. And the tendency, the unhelpful tendency we have, either just to kind of go around fabricating blame for somebody for whose fault that was, right? Or blaming oneself, equally unhelpfully. Or the other tendency to just try and, you know, forget it. Move on, we unhelpfully say to each other, as if you can just move on. No, it's a practice of leaning into constraint, to actually seeing where I'm defensive, confused, hurt, wounded. And certainly, right, you know, one doesn't wish hurt and confusion and any of the troubles of a human heart or a human life on anyone. And sometimes, you know, people are really flawed by the difficulties they've lived through, you know, broken, you know, almost by the difficult, or really broken by the difficulties they've lived through. And hence the wish to actually take care of each other, be as supportive as we can to each other. And yet at the same time, there's something very potent and beautiful about people who have been able to lean into a lot of constraint. And, you know, some friends I've known who've been through a very, very disrupted, traumatic, you know, violence-filled early life. And the fact that they've had, you know, the courage and the support and the access to practices, etc., but the fact that they've basically mostly had the courage and the willingness to lean into that constraint, to digest that constraint, to metabolize their own woundedness. It's like something in that metabolizes into something very beautiful. In other words, the more you lean into constraint, the more you know freeness. That doesn't mean the more constraint you have. You don't need to go around, you know, looking for constraint. You've got enough. Right? We've all got enough to work with. But the more we lean into it, the more we listen to it, the more we're kind of gentle with it, the more we open to it, the more we learn from it. Because in the end, freeness and constraint are in the same place. On Wednesday night in Paris, I was at an event called Afro-Queer Rising. And I was one of 2 white, cis, straight men at that event. And it was very beautiful. It was a fundraising event for a collective called Afro-Queer Rising in Paris. And it was hosted by a friend of mine who's a singer and a drag performer. And he was kind of curating the event and introducing the different acts, and has an incredibly kind of warm and loving, beautiful, and very fun way of doing all of that. And what really stood out to me, it was very beautiful, the event, but it's like, oh, just reflecting on it in terms of constraint and freeness. It's like, here's a whole bunch of people, most of the audience, certainly all of the performers, who have been marginalized societally through racism, through homophobia, etc. And so they know a lot about the pain, the constraint of being excluded. And because they know a lot about it, and because they've leaned into that, they then know a lot about how to be inclusive. And so something just about the way that event was set up, the reminders to people, to us all, to be inclusive, to be non-judgmental, to be supportive, right? Just created such a kind of beautiful, supportive atmosphere, right? And it just struck me that's a good example of that. Right? The more you know about exclusion, in other words, the more you lean into, and we've all, in whatever way, you've had some experience of feeling excluded, misunderstood, ignored, sidelined. The more you can lean into your own hurt, let's call it, or whatever, right? The more you can metabolize it. The more you can metabolize it, the more you naturally discover about its opposite. Well, there's constraint over here. I don't like that. I want to go somewhere else called freeness. You see that a lot around teachings of not self as well. Right? It's one of the tricky misunderstandings, I think, in Buddhist teachings, because we recognize, oh, this self stuff, self can be hard work, self can be painful. I'm kind of sick of self. Self gets me into a lot of trouble. Self is neurotic, fearful, narcissistic, needy, greedy, lazy, crazy. But hold on, the Buddha said it's not real, not self. Oh. And so we want to get away from self towards some free realm of not self. But where are you going to find that? Where are you going to go? We don't find freedom from self somewhere else. We find it by leaning into the needy, greedy, lazy, crazy. Leaning into the hurt and confused and narcissistic. And it's like, seems to me we need to confront that's sort of counterintuitive again and again and again and again. Because however we might see that very often and very well and very frequently, but still the hope that I can find it elsewhere. It's a strong one, not to underestimate that. So, lean into constraint. We see our unhelpful relationship, tight relationship to it, and we develop certain trust and certain capacity to soften and open, and our experience opens up. And you can see for yourself, however you consider your degree of commitment to this practice, whatever the timeline of your practice, unless this is the very first day you've ever meditated, maybe you don't have quite enough momentum yet to see that. But if you have any kind of history and practice at all, you can recognize the truth that the more you lean in, the more things open up. In fact, it's only been worth bothering to continue in a practice because that's true. Right? If you'd just come along to a meditation class and nothing had happened, like you could see no value in it whatsoever, then you wouldn't have come back again. That's what happens. But people do come and see no value, and then they don't come back again. So why did you come back again? Because of that truth. Oh yeah, the more I lean in, the more things open up. And then sometimes it feels like things aren't opening up very much, because it's just like that. It's not a nice smooth growth curve. And sometimes it feels like, oh, things are opening up, but what? But not as fast as I'd like. Or it seems like, and maybe we blame ourselves for that. Things aren't opening up because I could be practicing more, and I could be more this, and I could be more that, which is always true, right? Even if you're meditating 23 hours a day, you could be meditating 23 and a half. It's always true, but it's usually not helpful to emphasize all the sense of lack in my practice, all the ways I could be doing it more and better. Much more helpful to recognize the goodness of what I am doing and the ways in which things are opening up, even if not in the way I expected, and maybe not quite in the way I would like. So partly there's that sense of, oh, things changing over time. And then partly, I referred to this a little bit this morning, there are those moments where the sense of opening up is of another order, an order that we don't really understand. We have some moment of a kind of maybe wonderful or maybe disconcerting, but a kind of shocking degree of space, or a shocking degree of ease, or a shocking degree of silence of mind. And something that really galvanizes our sense of possibility. And you can't confect that, right? You can't make that, you can't make insight happen. You can't make sudden opening happen. But you can keep putting yourself in the territory of practice where that happens. Like Krishnamurti says, you can't make the wind blow in through the window, but you can at least leave the window open. Right. Otherwise, no chance, or small chance. And so that's, you know, a lot of what our practice is doing. You just keep opening the window, and then noticing that I hadn't quite noticed, but I've shut it again. So you're opening it again and opening it again and opening it again, and then every now and then, whoa, the breeze blows through. And so some of what I was interested in today, in talking about a kind of variously called radical freeness or fundamental freeness. On the one hand, and you can see for yourself, on the one hand, maybe there's something very compelling or attractive about that. For me, that was very much the case. My teacher's pointing to radical freeness, not in a few lifetimes away, not something that happened to some guy 2,500 years ago, right? But no, here, now, available, the promise and the possibility of this practice for you and me and us. Found that very compelling. And yet not everybody. Sometimes we might find that intimidating. Sometimes we hear that and it's like, oh, that means I'm supposed to be there, or I'm supposed to make that happen, or if that's not happening for me, I'm somehow inadequate. No, you can't make the breeze blow through, but we can keep pointing out the breeze to each other. We can keep reminding each other of the breeze. We can keep supporting each other in opening and reopening the window. And and you're no doubt in sort of different places with that. But as we continue to open the window, and as we occasionally sense the breeze, or actually as we get just more skillful at really putting ourselves in the way of the breeze, letting the breeze blow through us, then our sense of what this is, body, mind, heart, consciousness, reality, world, everything, opens up in unimaginable ways, in indescribable ways. It's an interesting thing that in a way, the whole endeavor of practice has these twin elements. One is the element of freeing up our lives, and then the other is the element of being increasingly awake to the nature of life, nature of reality. And yet we're incapable of describing the nature of reality. All of us. I mean, nobody's ever managed to do it. Nobody could ever manage to do it. So we have these sort of epithets like freeness, but we're opening to or encountering something ungraspable. And so we get together in rooms like this and we try to kind of point each other into the open window. And we point to different dimensions of freeness and constraint, for example, like we're doing today. And we have this sort of model, so that's the model of today, freeness and constraint, and then we're constantly bringing our own experience to the model and seeing what we find in that comparison. And if we don't find anything, as I say, we don't come back. But because we're talking about something that's quite essential, quite universal, if we're honest and sincere, amazingly, we keep finding our own experience with our own dramas and details and history. We keep finding it reflected in these essential truths. Hence the encouragement, right? And just to just keep bringing one's experience bringing the stuff of our lives again and again. So we keep looking at freeness and constraint and seeing what we find. And and as I say, we often mistake the one for the other. We're hoping to find freeness in a realm of constraint, right? Like with the aging, sickness, death stuff, for example. We're hoping that I can just hang on to a solid sense of me, but that I can make it free. And I get to be Martin and to be free. Martin is bound by aging, sickness, and death. Martin is bound by the worldly winds of praise and blame. It's common, it's normal, right? We've spent, like we were saying this morning, we've spent these decades reinforcing a familiar sense of self. It's normal that we want it to be this familiar sense of self that gets also to have a sense of freeness. And then we tend to, that which is free by its nature, we tend to laminate or assume a sense of constraint to it. Right? My mind. Like in the questions this morning, where does speech come from? What's allowing us to breathe? Right? We're pointing very directly with those things to the free space out of which emergent experience happens. And yet we tend to keep reducing it to something called me. We laminate constraint onto it. Where does speech come from? Oh, well, it comes from my mind. Nothing wrong with saying that, right? That seems obvious in the moment. But actually, what do we mean by my mind? And usually we mean we've taken that which is inconceivably open, inconceivably vast, inconceivably free, and because I don't know how to land there, so we make it smaller and more familiar. And that leads a little bit then, maybe I'll finish saying something about choice and free will, the idea of choice. See, the idea that maybe we have no choice. It's very disconcerting. It tends to generate a lot of ideas, defensiveness, and all kinds of ideas where, of course, I have choice. So we'll hold it lightly. If it seems too unpalatable to you, no choice, no free will, then you're just going to leave it aside. But what do we mean by choice? Like, as if I get to choose. And we can probably cite some evidence. Look, right now, I can choose whether to pick up the glass or not pick up the glass. I've got a choice to make. People often come to me and say, I've got a choice, I've got a decision to make. And what we're doing, we're laminating a sense of freedom onto a sense of constraint, right? As if I have the freedom to choose. I have the freedom. It's very seductive. Of course, I have the freedom to choose. It seems so obvious. And I think it's helpful. Are some of you familiar with the sort of the kind of philosophical debate around free will and determinism and some of the terminology around that? Okay, so we maybe go a little into that. While I'm happy to align with the recognition that there's no free will, I'm not at all happy to go to the other extreme, which mostly anyone who denies free will ends up in the other end. Therefore, the idea of a determinism. I would say no free will and no determinism. And we'll see if we can get there and bring in a bit of the Buddha as well. Where was I? So the terms I like to use are ontological choice and experiential choice. So I would say there's no ontological choice, but there is experiential choice. In other words, we have an undeniable sense of being able to choose. And it's important to recognize that. Having said that, is what's really happening me choosing? There's different ways you can look at it. You can go back to the past, where it seems obvious. At any point, when I chose to come here today, I could have chosen to stay in bed instead. Right? But that's sort of meaningless because it's completely unverifiable, for a start. It's just you're ad hoc. You're adding the sense of choice to something that you can't ever test. And also, then the sort of the usual thought experiment of that is that if you actually rewind the universe to that moment in bed this morning, and all the conditions are exactly the same, right? Well, then how could I have done it any differently? If all the conditions are exactly the same, then out of those conditions, the same response would arise. So what's it like to just give some consideration to just putting down the idea that I could have ever chosen to do anything differently? Just to see. You don't have to adopt it as a philosophical position, but just to see what does it give rise to. Oh, and then we might go forward into the future. Tomorrow, I've got usually people come up with some life choice. I've been offered a job. Shall I do this? Shall I do that? As if I'm going to choose. I need to choose. I need to make a decision. It's very seductive. Again, you put me at the beginning of it all. You put me in the middle of it all. I can choose. But then track what happens in what we call decision making. Actually, we're being influenced by all kinds of factors, right? Those influences also draw on our conditioning. Influenced by that which I find attractive. And I don't decide what to find attractive. I don't decide who to find attractive. I don't decide what I like. I didn't decide to like chocolate and to not like baked beans. I don't like baked beans. But I didn't decide. Right? It just happens. So then when I have a decision to make, I'm being influenced by that which I find attractive and that which I don't. I'm being influenced by my imagined projections, because I can't ever know, of what it would be like to take that choice and what it would be like to take that choice. Right? And at some point, those influencing factors line up in such a way that I'm drawn to that. And then I say, well, I decided to, like, I'm giving myself too much credit. I'm giving myself too much agency, giving myself too much control, and giving myself too much freedom, as if it was a free choice, a free decision. Right? Experientially it is, but ontologically it means when we look into the heart of it, and it's important because then we're actually able to, rather than telling ourselves a story of I decide or that I've got to decide, and all the pressure that goes with that, can actually just meet that process more honestly. Oh, here are the different factors pulling on me. And then we see how those factors move on us. And then we're free of the idea that I'm responsible for it all. Well, the other thing that happens in what we call decisions is none of those factors are winning out, and we don't know. And we come and say, oh, I don't know what to decide. But at some point, the pressure, time pressure, or the pressure of those factors, or somebody saying, right, you need to decide now. At some point, the pressure of those means that we lurch one way or the other. We're getting pushed by conditioning, and then we say, I decided.
So what would you say instead of I decided?
I probably would say it, right? Because experientially, we live as if. There's this kind of, there's a very cool French philosopher who I don't know much of his work, but his name is Michel Bitbol. And I once saw a conversation that he and the Dalai Lama had in Delhi. I don't know why this guy was in Delhi, but a friend invited me. And they were debating like this existence and non-existence, Buddhist philosophy. So do things exist or do they not exist? I mean, get caught. If we say this exists, we lose the whole of the rest of the universe, right? Because you can't separate anything out from all the conditions. You can't separate this out from the space around it. Can't separate it out from its constituent parts. You can't separate it out from time, etc. Right? So if we say this exists, you lose everything else. You give it too much. But if you say this doesn't exist, then you lose the bowl.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do? Are you going to lose the bowl, or are you going to lose the rest of the universe? Right? And so we end up in this things neither exist nor don't exist. Right? Which is a non-landing place. Right? It's actually much better. It's much better than things exist or things don't exist. Right? There is a self or there isn't a self. Right? They're too fixed. That's the positions. You do have choice or you don't have choice. Actually, things appear as if they exist. This is Michel Bitbol's thing, as if it's brilliant. As soon as I heard that, it was, yes, we inhabit an as if reality. Right? We live as if we have choice. Right? So then you don't need to retreat into the over-reliance on self. It's me who chooses. And you don't have to live in the denial and the confusing denial of self, of choice, which ends up as being, or inevitably falling into determinism. Right? So there's no free will, no free choice. And therefore, one lands in the idea that everything is just as it's meant to be. You have your choice. You're kind of a victim of reality, and it doesn't make any difference what you do. No, we live as if we have choice. So you free oneself up from the burden of actually being the one who chooses, but free oneself up from a kind of nihilistic, deterministic process. The way the Buddha talks about it is in terms of two types of karma. Right? So karma just means action, literally, but it really means action in terms of the momentum, the way action produces reaction, cause and effect. So what are the two types of karma? The Buddha talks about this. The karma of the past, which is ripening in the present. Right? And that kind of karma you can do nothing about, because it's too late. How can you affect the past? You can't. So, but it is the karma of the past, right? The very fact that I've seen some of you before is what allows me to recognize you when I see you today. Right? We're just constantly, inevitably drawing on, consciously or not, we're constantly just receiving the imprints of all our past experience, which is forming our sense of reality in the present. Right? You've got no choice. Yeah. But then what's the second type of karma? The second type of karma, action, right? And the momentum it creates is the way we're engaging in the moment. Right? The way we're engaging with the moment. The where I direct my attention. Right? The how I open my eyes, the what I'm listening to. And what we find, we can put aside ideas of choice or not, but what we find is that our actual immediate living experience is full of a sense of possibility. Right? Full of a sense of possibility. And then we're invited to see, how am I moved to make good use of this possibility? What's a skillful response to this possibility? Here are the various constraints of my life. Here they are, appearing freely. How shall I respond? That's Dharma practice. Here are the constraints of my life. Here they are as freely appearing emergence. How shall I respond? And it's in the contemplation of freeness and constraint, and it's in the deepening skill of the response that we find a way of navigating a free life in a world of constraints. And as I say, that's the invitation. That's the promise. That's the real possibility.